Her daughter-in-law mocked her cough, right at the dinner table. Maggie Flynn, retired pianist and widow, didn't flinch. Lindsay topped off her wine, thinking age came with silence. By morning her name was erased from the will, the deed, and every right she once assumed permanent. Maggie had spent years hosting their legacy. Now she was curating her own. And when they circled back for the house, the trust would answer louder than she ever had. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Maggie Flynn coughed. Just once. A light, dry sound, barely more than a breath catching on the edge of her chest as she reached for the salad bowl. Yet across the polished oak dining table, Lindsay's face twisted like something sour had just landed on her plate. "Don't cough at the table. It's gross," Lindsay said, lips pinched and eyebrows arched like a scolding teacher from a bad memory. The words dropped hard, sharper than the clink of silverware, sharper than the snap of roasted lamb bones just moments earlier. The room held still for a beat too long. Brian didn't look up from his plate. He kept sawing at his meat like nothing had been said, eyes trained somewhere beneath the mashed potatoes. Tessa froze, fork midair, eyes wide, her cheeks flushed pink as she stared down at the peas she'd been arranging in clusters. Her 10-year-old face bore that small confused frown kids wear when the adults get mean for no good reason. Maggie didn't say a word. She reached for her napkin with slow, deliberate fingers, folded it once, then again. The faint texture of linen caught at her knuckles, a grounding detail in a room that had gone numb. She rose from her chair, the scrape of wood against hardwood echoing louder than the cough itself had. With the same patient grace she once taught piano scales, she gathered her plate, her water glass, and walked toward the kitchen. No one stopped her. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and lemon oil, rich meat and over-sterilized counters. She rinsed her plate under hot water, her fingertips turning pink as steam curled up around her face. She could still hear them in the dining room. Awkward laughter, forks scraping, the performance resuming. She didn't return. Back in the dining room, Ruth watched her sisters retreat with narrowed eyes. She set down her wine glass, a little too firmly, and fixed Lindsay with a look, a warning cloaked in grandmotherly patience. But Lindsay didn't notice. She was already pouring herself more Chardonnay, the label perfectly facing out. Upstairs, Maggie stood at the threshold of her bedroom, the door closing with a soft but final click. She walked to the corner where the oil painting of a seagull over calm water hung above a small wall safe. Brian had given her the painting years ago, saying it reminded him of peace. She always thought it looked lonely. She slid the painting aside and spun the dial. Right 30, left 14, right 9, click. Inside sat several items, legal documents, a velvet pouch, an envelope yellowing slightly at the edges. She reached past the rest and pulled out a slim folder, black leather stiff from age. The original will. She carried it to the bed and sat, feeling the creak of the mattress beneath her. The bedside lamp cast a warm pool of light across the pages as she opened them. She read slowly, methodically. Everything was still there: names, divisions, designations. Her husband's name in neat typewritten letters. Her son's, and Lindsay's bold as brass. Co-beneficiary. 7 years untouched. Maggie's fingers hovered over the lines, but her mind went elsewhere. To the hospital room where Brian had stayed only 2 nights before his father passed. To the clipboard she signed alone. To the silence she filled, then stopped trying to. A notification buzzed from her phone. She picked it up. Lindsay's Instagram post, captioned in cheerful font over a filtered image of roast lamb. Sunday dinners with the fam minus manners. Maggie took a screenshot, saved it in a folder she'd quietly labeled review. She reached again into the folder, removed a small white card with embossed letters. Martin Sloan, estate attorney. His number hadn't changed in 20 years. She dialed. He answered almost immediately. Maggie. Everything all right? She took her time before answering. I'd like to make a change to the will. Something long overdue. There was a pause on the other end. Then I'll come by tomorrow. First thing. She hung up and slid the folder back into the safe, but the will she kept on the nightstand, beneath her reading glasses and the lavender balm Tessa had given her last Christmas. A different kind of document now. Not a record of intent, but a declaration of who mattered, and who no longer did. From the hallway she could hear voices rise again, forced laughter, a plate clattering lightly against a fork. She locked the door, drew the curtain, and turned out the light. They passed the butter like nothing had happened. Just a quiet clink of silver and china, hands gliding over linen placemats like clockwork. But Maggie Flynn sat in her upstairs bedroom, the draft of evening air brushing against her bare ankles, and passed judgment. The will lay open in front of her, its corners worn soft, the ink faded slightly, but still sharp enough to cut. Her late husband's name was printed clearly, just beneath her own. She traced it with the pad of her finger, then slid her eyes down to the line she hadn't looked at in years. Lindsay Flynn, co-beneficiary. Maggie let out a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff, just a breath laced with disbelief. The paper felt heavier in her hands now, as if the weight of her silence had seeped into it over the years. She remembered the hospice room with its lemon-scented sheets and buzzing monitors. Brian had shown up late that first night, and hadn't come again. It was Maggie who sat beside her husband's bed, who signed the palliative consent forms with steady hands, while the doctor avoided eye contact. Lindsay had never come at all, and yet there she was, enshrined in ink, entitled, Legal. The desk light flickered slightly, as the wind hissed against the window pane. Maggie picked up her phone and opened Instagram. She didn't expect to see anything new, but there it was. Lindsay, all angles and filters, smiling with a wine glass lifted near her cheek. The caption, Sunday dinners with the fam minus manners. Maggie stared at it a full 5 seconds before her thumb tapped the screenshot button. The image zipped neatly into her photo folder, and then she filed it under the album she'd started that spring. Review, quiet title, loud purpose. She picked up her phone again, and scrolled to a contact she hadn't used since the estate was last adjusted. Martin Sloan. The name alone brought back memories of contracts and condolence letters, of the man who'd once told her, a will is less about death than about clarity. She pressed call. Hey, Margaret, he answered, voice gravelly but warm. Is it time? It is, she said. No hesitation. I'd like to make some adjustments. Understood. I can come by Thursday. No, Maggie replied, already flipping to her calendar. Tomorrow. She hung up and placed the phone down, her hand resting over the will like she was steadying it. The house was quiet now, the hum of the dishwasher rising faintly from the kitchen below. Through the window, porch light spilled across the lawn, casting shadows from the old white rockers. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Ruth stood in the doorway, arms crossed loosely over a fleece cardigan, a half-finished cup of tea in one hand. You're not watching Jeopardy, she said, eyeing the will. Not tonight. Ruth walked in without waiting for permission, like she always had, and set the tea on the side table. Her eyes flicked to the folder. About damn time, she murmured. Then more gently, long overdue, Maggie. Maggie nodded. No need to explain. Ruth had been at the same table, heard the same comment, felt the same chill that had rippled through the room like a second-hand slap. She didn't say so, but she didn't have to. The wind outside picked up again, tapping dry leaves against the window like fingers trying to get in. Maggie closed the folder and slid it back into the leather case. Her phone buzzed. A text from Martin. We'll draw up a codicil. Effective immediately. Maggie turned off the desk lamp and let the room fall into soft dusk. One change made. More would follow. She tried to push Maggie out with a look, so Maggie cleared her own seat before anyone could. The following Sunday, the Flynn family gathered around the long mahogany table just as they always had. The roast chicken glistened under the soft light, bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans were set with familiar rhythm, and Lindsay poured the wine with the performance of a well-trained hostess. But Maggie's seat, third from the head, The one with the slightly crooked leg and needlepoint cushion she'd sewn herself, sat empty. In its place was a vase. Long-stemmed ivory roses, fresh and faintly perfumed, their petals slightly curled from the summer heat. A handwritten card rested beneath the blooms, addressed simply, to the house, not the table. Ruth had placed it just as Maggie asked. "She's not coming?" Brian asked, eyeing the flowers with a mild confusion he didn't bother hiding. "She needed space," Ruth replied, lifting her water glass. "Not silence. Just space." Lindsay gave a tight smile, swirling her Pinot Grigio like it might change the subject. "It's probably for the best. She needs rest." Her tone landed too clean, too quick, as though rehearsed in the car. Across the table, Tessa said nothing. Her eyes lingered on the empty chair like it might explain itself. Miles away, in her upstairs parlor, with the blinds half drawn, and the fan ticking in the corner, Maggie sat at her own table, a small bistro round with faded paint, and a single white candle burning low. The music box that once sat on Brian's childhood dresser played its last few notes as she closed the lid. It was carved cherry wood, lined with velvet, and had been a gift to him when he turned 10. She'd wrapped it earlier that morning and mailed it to an old student, Jamie Kessler, who had once spent entire summers playing sonatas in her studio while his parents worked double shifts. The card inside read, "To someone who never stopped listening." She stood, wiped her hands on a linen towel, and returned to the hallway. Her footsteps were silent on the hardwood. She passed the guest room and paused briefly at the closet. Inside, a cedar chest. She opened it. One by one she began removing heirlooms, silver napkin rings, a ceramic pitcher from her grandmother's side, the quilt Ruth had helped her stitch the year Brian was born. Each item went into a labeled bin, carefully catalogued and sorted. A future she was rebuilding, piece by piece, away from those who expected to inherit without earning. That evening Tessa stopped by with a small paper bag of cookies she and her mom had baked. She came alone, as she often did. "Grandma," she said, stepping into the front hallway and sniffing the lavender air, "where's the piano?" Maggie looked up from the old photo album on her lap. "With someone who listens." Tessa blinked, puzzled. "You gave it away." "I moved it forward," Maggie replied gently, closing the album. "Music needs space to grow, not just walls to echo inside." The girl nodded slowly, as if that made sense in a way words didn't quite capture. She reached into the cookie bag, took two out and handed one to Maggie. In the quiet after Tessa left, Maggie returned to her desk. A soft breeze moved through the window screen, bringing with it the scent of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. The kind of Nebraska evening where the sky looked bruised purple just before dark. She opened the top drawer and removed her medical directive, her advance care plan. Lindsay's name stared back at her under healthcare proxy. She uncapped a pen and, without hesitation, crossed it out. It was a quiet Friday evening, Nebraska skies streaked peach and lavender as twilight settled over the porch's chipped railings. Maggie lit the candles herself, 3 slender tapers in the center of her small round table, their flames dancing low against polished wine glasses. No centerpiece, no forced smiles, just 4 place settings, and a warmth that came from real presence, not duty. Ruth arrived first, wrapped in her houndstooth coat, and carrying a cherry pie she insisted on slicing herself. Martin came next, a little winded from the walk up the porch steps but smiling all the same, his briefcase swinging at his side. Then came Claire and Ben, 2 of Maggie's former students now in their 30s, both still calling her Miss Flo, despite her years of protests. They hugged her like family, because they were. The dining room, once burdened by performance and polite silences, now felt lived in. Maggie had turned off the overheads and opened the windows. The air inside carried hints of rosemary, lemon butter, and the rich sweetness of baked apples. Dusk painted soft shadows on the wood-paneled walls, and the piano in the parlor stood open, as if waiting. To years of being told to be quiet, Ruth said, raising her glass of red. And finally speaking. To truth, said Claire. To legacy, Martin added. They clinked their glasses with the easy reverence of people who had earned this moment. Later, as the guests lingered with second helpings and stories long tucked away, a small knock came at the back door. Maggie opened it to find Tessa, half hiding behind the doorframe, her sneakers untied and her cheeks flushed from biking over. I brought you something, the girl whispered, holding out a folded sheet of paper. It was a crayon drawing, Maggie at the piano, her hands glowing like golden light, with musical notes swirling around her head like birds. The colors weren't neat, but they were loud and free. Maggie crouched beside her and smiled. You're always drawing me, she said. Tessa shrugged. You're the only one who looks like they're doing something. Maggie slipped a folded note into the girl's hand, deliberate, quiet, like passing a match that hadn't yet been struck. This is your legacy now, she whispered. Keep it safe. Tessa tucked it into her pocket without reading it. She hugged Maggie tight, then vanished back into the dusk like a secret kept just between them. By Saturday, Maggie had emptied half the upstairs guest closet. She moved slowly but with intention. Pearl earrings wrapped in tissue, heirloom linens, folded into boxes, photo albums, labeled but closed. She rented a small climate-controlled storage unit on the south side of town and began relocating pieces of her life. Not for safekeeping, for rerouting. That afternoon, while Maggie was out with Ruth arranging deliveries, Brian wandered through her hallway, hand brushing against the banister like he used to as a boy. He paused at the wall safe. Something in him itched nostalgia or guilt, it wasn't clear. Downstairs, Lindsay was already looking through the china cabinet. Where's the pearl brooch? Brian asked, lifting a box and finding it empty. Lindsay didn't even turn around. Why would I know? She said it lightly, but her tone cracked at the edges. That night, long after the sun dipped below the fields and porch lights blinked on across the neighborhood, Lindsay returned to the safe. She stood in the study with the door locked behind her, a thin sheen of sweat forming at her brow as she spun the combination she'd memorized the year Maggie got bronchitis. Click. She opened the door, breath shallow with anticipation. Inside, there were no documents. No brooch. No envelopes or velvet-lined boxes. Only a single card, typed in bold sans serif, resting neatly on the shelf. Not yours. She had shamed Maggie once in front of family, in front of food, in front of history, but Maggie Flynn had no intention of staying where she wasn't wanted. So she redrew the table, every seat, every setting, every name. On Monday morning, Martin Sloane sat across from her in the sunlit corner of her sitting room. The coffee between them steamed gently, untouched. Maggie wore a navy cardigan, sleeves rolled, and held a pen like a conductor preparing to raise the baton. The new will lay open before her, crisp and unburdened. Martin cleared his throat, tapping one section with his finger. This clause ensures full revocation of all previous designations. Lindsay is no longer entitled to any inheritance, joint access, or discretionary authority. Maggie nodded, eyes unwavering. And here, he continued, you're establishing a long-term education and wellness trust in Tessa's name. It's locked until she's 25 unless specified otherwise. She listens, Maggie said, signing her name in firm strokes. That deserves legacy. Martin sat back, watching her carefully. You understand, once this is filed, there's no clean way back. Maggie's voice didn't waver. That's the point. By Wednesday, Maggie had dropped the sealed envelope into the county clerk's lockbox herself. She watched it disappear through the steel slot with the same calm finality she once had closing recital doors after the last note faded. There was no tremble in her hands, only resolve. Meanwhile, Lindsay was busy hosting what she called a soft launch supper, a trial run for a new social circle that featured new stemware and a different kind of table altogether. Maggie had heard about it through Ruth, who'd seen the photos online. White linens, glass charger plates, a decorative sign above the mantel that read "Gratitude Lives Here." There was one detail that stood out in the images. Maggie's dining chair, the one with the floral needlepoint, wasn't at the table. It was shoved in the corner of the garage, half covered in paint tarps, barely visible behind a folding ladder. Ruth had clicked her tongue when she saw the image. They want you to vanish. Maggie poured herself a small splash of bourbon and replied, cool and even, I'm doing the opposite. Later that week, Brian showed up unannounced. He stood on Maggie's porch like a teenager caught sneaking out, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes darting. He began, stepping inside. Can we not make this messy? Please? Maggie didn't answer right away. She led him into the parlor, offered him a seat, and lowered herself slowly into the rocker across from him. The room smelled faintly of oranges and pine. She'd been cleaning earlier. Preparing. You made it messy, she said at last. When you made it silent. Brian's mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to defend. He looked around the room as if trying to find something familiar. But the piano was gone. The framed family photos had been replaced with sketches of birds and rivers, gifts from former students. Maggie had made her edits. He left without a word. That evening, as dusk stretched over Lincoln and the cicadas hummed in the trees, a postal truck pulled up in front of Lindsay and Brian's house. The carrier knocked twice, handed over a certified envelope, and walked away without a glance. Lindsay tore the seal with the casual impatience of someone used to packages labeled urgent, but this wasn't from a boutique or a charity gala. It was from Maggie's attorney. The letter inside was short, cold, legally impenetrable. Subject: removal of rights, acknowledgement effective immediately. All prior entitlements nullified. Lindsay read it once, then again. Her wine glass tipped slightly in her hand. The kitchen light flickered as the air conditioning kicked on, louder than usual. But the house no longer belonged to the story she thought she was living. She whispered behind her wine glass, thinking no one heard. But Maggie had kept the tape. It had started innocently, a gift from a friend in her book club, a sleek, thumb-sized recorder with voice activation. You never know when you'll want to remember something, the woman had said with a wink. At first Maggie used it to capture piano pieces, the rhythm of wind through her lace curtains, or the way Ruth's voice cracked when she read poetry aloud. But in March, after Lindsay began wandering uninvited into her room, under the pretense of checking in, Maggie had tucked the recorder into the corner of her bookshelf. It blended into the shadow of a porcelain music box, and it didn't blink or beep. It simply listened. The playback was clean, crisp, and damning. She's coughing up money that's not even ours yet, Lindsay had muttered one evening, her voice slurred with wine and contempt. Honestly, I'm just waiting for the wheeze to turn into a will. Maggie paused the tape. Her breath caught in her throat, not from bronchitis, but from something colder, something heavier. She rewound, played it again. Same tone, same cruelty, tucked into an offhand moment like it didn't matter, but it did. She emailed the audio to Martin, attaching the file with a subject line that read, "Private documentation, recorded in home." Within the hour, he replied, "Filed under abuse indicators. Passive psychological. Logged and time-stamped. Well done." Later that week, Brian stopped by, awkward and apologetic, holding a grocery bag with a single bottle of ginger ale and a box of tissues, as if that would soften the blow. "She didn't mean it," he said, standing in the hallway, staring at the floor. "She talks out of stress sometimes. We've all said things we don't." Maggie cut him off, with the calm of a woman who'd spent her life counting down measures and holding posture through mistakes. "Then she shouldn't have said it in my house." Brian looked up, finally meeting her eyes. His expression flickered, guilt, maybe, or fear. It was hard to tell anymore. "She's overwhelmed, Mom." "So am I," Maggie replied, her voice clear and strong. "But I don't weaponize it." That night, Ruth poured her a neat 2 fingers of bourbon and lit a single candle on the kitchen table. "You taught half this town to speak up," she said, passing over the glass. "You've earned the right to speak for yourself." Maggie said nothing, just nodded and sipped. In the quiet that followed, she returned to her study. The ink in her printer had barely cooled from earlier. Lined up neatly on the desk were 3 printed pages, transcripts of the recording, time-stamped and labeled. She slipped them into a folder labeled Family Archive, filed just beneath Tessa's crayon drawings, and a copy of the revised trust. They'd assumed her silence meant surrender, but it had only ever meant surveillance. On Sunday morning, Maggie woke to a notification pinging her phone. Lindsay had posted a photo, a filtered black and white shot of Maggie in the garden from 2 summers ago. One Maggie didn't know had been taken. The caption read, "Strong women run in this family. So grateful for our matriarch blessed legacy family first." Maggie stared at it. The artificial lighting, the fake sentiment, the hashtags. Screenshot. Saved. She opened the review folder and dropped the image inside, right beneath the clip labeled Lindsay waiting for the will.mp3. She thought Maggie was just waiting to die. But Maggie Flynn was writing the next chapter with sharper ink and a pen no one else saw coming. At Lincoln First National, behind frosted glass and a closed door labeled Private Trusts, Maggie sat across from Elijah Crane, a man too young to remember her piano studio, but old enough to address her as Miss Flynn, with genuine respect. His charcoal gray suit didn't intimidate her. She'd faced tougher audiences in recital halls and lived through colder silences at dinner tables. "I want the trust airtight," Maggie said, placing a folder on the desk with a firm thud. "Educational, residential, medical, every penny stays with her. No access until she's 25. Earlier only if I say so. In writing." Elijah skimmed the documents, nodding slowly. "Tessa Flynn, your granddaughter, the only one who listens," Maggie replied. For 2 hours they crafted the future in deliberate lines and legal shields. Tessa's name was typed with reverence into every clause. School funds, emergency health allocations, a down payment clause for a future home in her name alone. There would be no room for Lindsay's manipulation, no opportunity for Brian's passivity to unravel it. Not this time. Back at the house, Ruth was already knee-deep in Maggie's attic, wrapped in a plaid scarf and dust from 3 decades of boxed-up memories. She held up a photo album, the plastic cover cracked but still intact. "Remember this?" Ruth called down the ladder. "The red recital, you in that velvet blazer playing Claire de Lune like it was a war cry." Maggie laughed from the kitchen below. "That blazer still lives in the coat closet, but it doesn't fit anger like it used to." They spent the afternoon sorting. Frames, metronomes, faded programs. Maggie kept what mattered. The rest went into donation bins labeled Next Chapter. Later that evening, just before the sky folded itself into stars, Tessa knocked on the back door with her bike helmet askew and her sketch pad under one arm. The house smelled of cinnamon toast and lavender polish. Ruth's cleaning habits had a way of layering over time like Maggie's old sheet music. "You always keep the music on, Grandma," Tessa said, setting her sketch pad on the counter. "Even when no one's here." Maggie looked at her, soft-eyed. "That's when it matters most." She reached into the drawer beneath the tea towels and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside sat a delicate gold locket, warm from resting against the wood. She pressed it into Tessa's palm. "There's a key inside," Maggie said. "It's not for a door." "Not exactly." Tessa opened it, puzzled. Inside was a tiny brass key, no longer than her pinky nail. She ran her thumb over it slowly, like it might hum. "What's it for?" she asked. Maggie smiled. "One day it'll make sense. Until then, keep it close." Just as Tessa slipped it around her neck, the front door opened. Lindsay stepped in with her usual breeze of perfume and performative urgency. "What's this?" she asked, eyeing the locket. "A reward for coughing." Her voice was syruped in sarcasm. Maggie didn't flinch. Tessa didn't answer. She simply zipped up her jacket and slipped out the door, the locket tucked safely beneath her shirt. That night, after Ruth had gone, and the house fell into that quiet hum only known to women who live alone by choice, Maggie returned to her study. She took out a thick envelope, opened her desk drawer, and removed a sheet of cream-colored stationery. She wrote by hand, neat cursive, no room for misinterpretation. The ink bled slightly where her hand trembled, but the message stayed strong. She sealed the letter and walked to the back corner of her closet, past the rows of boots and a crate of unsent Christmas cards. She opened the second safe, the one even Brian didn't know about, and locked the letter inside. They cooked lamb. Maggie smelled it from the end of the block. Rosemary, garlic, seared fat perfuming the air like a bribe. But silence was the main course on that table, and Maggie Flynn hadn't come hungry. Earlier that afternoon, the invitation arrived on thick cardstock, overcompensating in weight, light on sincerity. A handwritten message inside read, "Join us tonight for a peaceful family dinner. Let's put the past behind us. Love, Lindsay." Maggie read it over her sink, suds clinging to her wrists. She didn't laugh, didn't scoff, just peeled the note open again, like she was checking for some invisible ink that might tell the truth. She held it out to Ruth, who had just walked in with a Tupperware of lemon bars. Ruth snorted before even reading. "You know it's a trap, right?" "It's always a trap," Maggie replied, wiping her hands on a towel. "But this one comes garnished with mint." Still, she didn't toss the card. Instead, she laid it on the counter like a specimen, something to study, not something to answer. By 6:30, the Flynn house 2 doors down was lit up like a stage. Cars lined the driveway. Through the windows, Maggie could see a table set for 8, wine glasses sparkling, Lindsay circling the table in a pale blouse that caught the light just right. But Maggie's own kitchen was already humming with warmth. Tessa sat cross-legged at the bench in front of Maggie's old upright piano, her fingers pressing softly at the keys. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and a piece of masking tape with her name on it was stuck to the music stand, something she'd added herself, proud and unprompted. The notes she played were halting but honest, no pretense, the kind of music that spills out windows and doesn't ask permission to stay. "I missed this sound," Tessa said between chords. "It feels like you." Maggie was setting down 2 bowls of soup, her mother's barley and leek recipe, the one no one else had learned. She glanced toward the window. The lace curtain danced slightly in the breeze, and through it the soft shadows of the gathering next door played against the lawn, like echoes of a life she'd already walked away from. "I missed being heard," Maggie said. As Tessa played, the piano's low hum drifted outside, down the walk, into the street like something spilled and uncontainable. Brian passed by then, on foot alone, hands in the pockets of his tan coat. He stopped at the sidewalk in front of Maggie's house. The window glowed amber. He could see his mother standing beside the piano, head tilted toward Tessa, her posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months. He didn't knock, didn't wave. He just stood there and watched, as if waiting for something to be offered that wasn't his to ask for anymore. Inside, Maggie saw him. She didn't move. Let him look. Let him feel the weight of a dinner seat he no longer knew how to claim. 10 minutes later, the lights at Lindsay's house dimmed for dessert. Maggie rinsed 2 bowls, placed them gently in the sink, and dried her hands on a clean towel, embroidered, faded hers. She walked to her study and opened the bottom drawer of her desk, where a manila folder sat waiting, every paper inside notarized, dated and initialed. She flipped to the final page, deed of transfer 1246 Hickory Lane. The house. Her house. She signed it in silence, no flourish, no second thoughts. Then she clipped the papers together and slid them into an overnight envelope addressed to Elijah Crane at the trust office downtown. They ate under her roof, laughed under her lights, passed judgment across her table like it was their right. But today they read about who owns it, and for once the ink didn't lie. Maggie Flynn stood beside Elijah Crane in the echoing marble atrium of the Lancaster County Courthouse. Her breath fogged slightly in the overly air-conditioned space, but her spine stayed straight. In her hand, a thick folder. In her chest, a calm so resolute it almost startled her. The clerk called her name. Elijah stepped forward, placed the documents on the counter. His voice was measured, precise. Full property transfer. Title reassigned to a Protected Education Foundation beneficiary, Tessa Flynn. The clerk stamped it. 3 times. Hard. Final. No ceremony. No applause. Just the low, mechanical sound of a life quietly rewritten. By the time Lindsay found out, Maggie was back home, trimming dead roses from the garden bed along the front porch. The sun was high and unforgiving, but Maggie wore her broad straw hat like armor. Lindsay came stomping through the yard in heeled sandals, waving a folded envelope like a threat. "You gave the house to Tessa? This is our home." Maggie didn't stop clipping. "It was." "You're insane," Lindsay hissed, voice shrill now. "This house was part of our plan. Brian and I, this is legacy." Maggie finally looked up, her shears glinting in the light. "Now it has a purpose, one that won't rot in entitlement." Lindsay's mouth fell open. Her face flushed, not from heat but rage. She turned to the door, but it didn't budge. Maggie had changed the locks that morning, quietly, legally. No more shared keys, no more access by default. Brian showed up an hour later. He didn't yell, he didn't plead. He just sat in the car at the edge of the driveway, engine off, the same way he used to sit outside his high school girlfriend's house after they fought. Like time would soften something if he just waited long enough. He stayed that way for 3 nights. Maggie knew. She saw the car lights cut across her blinds at midnight, heard the idle engine hum in the early mornings, but she didn't invite him in. She'd already removed his name from the house insurance, the utility accounts, even the mailbox forwarding notice. Some things were better learned from silence. Ruth arrived on the 4th evening with a peach cobbler and the soft click of sympathy in her voice. "He's out there again," she said, placing the dessert on the counter. "I know. You could. I could." Maggie interrupted gently. "But I won't." Ruth sighed, nodding. Then after a moment, "It's not revenge, you know." Maggie poured 2 cups of chamomile tea. "No, it's preservation." In the study, Martin had already stacked the last of the asset transfer forms into a single leather-bound file. Investments, bonds, rights to personal property, all placed under new designations, all funneled through a firewall of trusts and protections Lindsay couldn't touch. Tessa wouldn't fully inherit it all yet, but the foundation would hold the property for her, and the home would serve as a space for her future, not someone else's control. "There's nothing left to contest," Martin said, sliding a pen across the desk. "No loopholes, no probate." Maggie took the pen, uncapped it with a click that echoed more than it should have, and signed the last affidavit. 3 words sat in bold at the bottom of the form: undisputable intent. She underlined it. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. Someone shouting, "Lindsay probably." But Maggie didn't rise to check. She just leaned back in her chair, the morning light slanting across her shoulder, and whispered, "Done." She wanted Maggie silent at the table, unseen, unheard, slowly erased. So Maggie tore the table out and remodeled the entire kitchen. The demolition started on a Tuesday. Sharp, efficient bangs of hammers echoed through the house like punctuation marks. The long oak dining table, the one Lindsay insisted defined the family, was the first to go. Maggie watched from the doorway, arms folded, as 2 contractors carried it out in pieces. She didn't blink. That table had hosted too many empty smiles, and too much weaponized etiquette. By Thursday the room was unrecognizable. The old brass chandelier was gone, replaced with soft pendant lights that cast golden pools of warmth over the counters. The dark cabinets had been sanded and repainted a soothing cream. She'd spared no expense. This was where she lived now, not just where she served. Instead of a long communal table, Maggie installed an island with 2 tall stools, a built-in herb shelf beneath the window, and a breakfast nook tucked into the corner where the morning light hit just right. Everything was scaled for comfort, conversation, intimacy, not performance. Ruth stood in the doorway that afternoon, shaking her head slowly. "Well, damn," she said. "It finally feels like your kitchen again." Maggie handed her a fresh cup of dark roast and slid onto one of the new stools. "It never was. I just made the move." They sat there, sipping while the aroma of rosemary biscuits floated through the room. Maggie's voice for once didn't feel like it had to shrink to fit the space. It carried bounced gently off tile and wood, settling like music in the air. No correction, no interruption. Out on the street, a car idled too long by the curb. Ruth peered through the blinds and gave a low whistle. Isn't that Lindsay's car? Maggie didn't move. She doesn't knock anymore. She just drives by and hopes the house will apologize. Sure enough, the SUV sat there, engine on, window cracked. Inside, Lindsay stared at the renovated kitchen through the large front bay window. Her brows knit so tightly they almost touched. Maggie caught the flicker of her lips moving, yelling something at no one. Then she slammed her palm on the steering wheel and sped off, tires spitting gravel in her wake. I think she just had a full-on meltdown. Ruth said. She's used to inheritance, Maggie replied. She's never met independence. Later that night, the phone rang. Brian's number. Maggie stared at the screen for a full 30 seconds. She didn't hesitate. She just pressed ignore and let it roll to voicemail. No tears, no temptation. If he left a message, she didn't check. In the new kitchen silence, Maggie reached into the drawer next to the herb shelf and pulled out a slim envelope. Inside, a brochure for the Oceanside Renewal Retreat. Women over 65, no baggage required. She laid it on the counter and pressed her palm flat over it. A weekend away. By the water. No place settings. No performance. Just rest. The last contractor stepped into the room, wiping his hands on his jeans. Everything's finished, he said, gesturing to the polished backsplash behind her stove. Feels like a reset. Maggie smiled. That's exactly what it is. She poured one last cup of coffee, sipped slowly and stared at the golden light spilling across the tile. She could still hear the echo of her own voice. Finally, it didn't sound like a stranger. She made noise about my cough, whispered at the table, sneered behind her wine glass. So Maggie found her peace in a place where no one talked unless they truly had something to say. The wind rolled off the ocean in long, cooling sweeps as Maggie stepped out of the shuttle van and onto the gravel lot of the Oceanside Renewal Retreat. The scent of salt, pine, and distant lavender greeted her with open arms. Waves crashed somewhere just beyond the tree line, rhythmic and indifferent, like a heartbeat that had never skipped for anyone's approval. The lodge was small, built of warm cedar and stone, tucked into the bluff like it had been waiting for women like her to find it. No husbands, no adult children asking for money, no Instagram filters, just women over 65 with calluses, secrets, and decades worth of breath they hadn't been allowed to exhale. Inside, Maggie was led to her room by a gray-haired volunteer named June, who wore wide linen pants and didn't ask too many questions. The room was simple, clean white walls, a window facing the sea, and a journal placed neatly on the desk. After unpacking, Maggie sat at the small writing table and opened her notebook. The pen moved across the page slowly, not with effort but with intent. There's dignity in exit plans, she wrote. Not in dying, but in choosing what you won't carry anymore. I am not a matriarch. I am not a name on their mail. I am not a guest in my own story. She tore the page gently and tucked it into the envelope she'd brought with her, addressed to herself. At lunch she joined a table of women with names like Darlene, Joyce and Minnie. They passed cornbread and stories like old recipes, messy, nourishing, always passed hand to hand. Someone asked what had brought Maggie here. She smiled, sipped her mint tea and said, "My cough started an earthquake." The table erupted in laughter. Maggie did too. That evening, after a short walk along the boardwalk, Maggie returned to her room to find a postcard slipped under the door. It was from Tessa. The front of the card had her most recent crayon drawing, Maggie at the piano, this time with a small girl playing beside her. In bright purple ink on the back, Tessa had written, "They framed my drawing on the wall at school. The music class picked it for the hallway. Love you always." Maggie placed the postcard upright on the nightstand and stared at it until the waves lulled her eyes closed. The next morning, Ruth called. Maggie picked up on the second ring. "Your daughter-in-law. Ruth began without preamble, has taken to knocking on the neighbors' doors. Apparently she's telling them the house was ripped out from under them, and you're senile. Maggie snorted. Do they believe her? Janet from across the street offered to punch her. Well then, Maggie said, her voice calm as still water. Let them whisper. I'm not listening. She hung up before Ruth could say more. She didn't need updates. The noise wasn't for her anymore. After breakfast, she joined a meditation circle on the lawn. The sea breeze tangled in her hair. Her knees ached. She didn't care. The only sound was wind and gulls. As the session ended, June approached with a clipboard in hand. Maggie Flynn. Yes? A message came through your attorney's office. He said it's urgent but good. Maggie stood slowly, brushing grass from her slacks. What is it? June smiled. The trust? It's been certified nationally. It's locked in. Irrevocable. Maggie's breath caught not from surprise, but from validation. The earthquake had settled. They wrote her off with silence, with smirks, with backhanded blessings disguised as concern. So Maggie wrote herself back in with ink and voice, and the kind of clarity that couldn't be ignored. She sat at her kitchen island, the same one Lindsay would never lean across again, and opened her laptop. The cursor blinked in the blank document like a dare. What elder power looks like, she typed at the top. It wasn't a memoir. It wasn't a rant. It was a reckoning. She wrote slowly, with the same deliberation she once used to teach minors and majors to children who hadn't yet learned their own voice mattered. Paragraph by paragraph, she carved out her story, not about age, but erasure, not about legacy, but reclamation. She told them about the table where she coughed and was shamed, about the voice she kept in the silence, about the will she rewrote and the name she passed forward to someone who still listened. I am not fading, she wrote. I am sharpening. When it was done, she emailed it to the Lincoln Register, not expecting much. Maybe a sidebar. Maybe a quiet thank you. She clicked send and went about her day. By nightfall it had been picked up by 3 other local outlets. By morning it had over 23,000 shares. The subject line read, "This woman just changed how I see my mother." Another silence isn't dignity, this proves it. By the end of the week, Maggie had an invitation in her inbox from the Nebraska Elder Rights Coalition. They wanted her to speak at their fall conference. Keynote, no time limit. Her first reaction was disbelief. Her second was to say yes. Ruth, predictably, offered to drive her. And heckle if anyone asks you a stupid question. Maggie smiled. I think I'll be fine, but save me a seat near the front. When the day came, the auditorium hummed with soft conversation and rustling pamphlets. Maggie stood backstage in a navy blazer and flat shoes, her palms dry, her breath steady. The lights overhead warmed her shoulders. Then she heard it, Tessa's voice from the podium, her granddaughter standing proud in a floral dress, reading a poem she'd written just for the occasion. She gave me her music, but not her silence. She gave me her stories, not her shame. She gave me a key. I opened the rest myself. Maggie stepped out into the light to applause that wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Real. After the talk there were handshakes. Emails requested. A line of women asking for copies of her op-ed. Maggie gave them her time. Every second felt earned. But not everyone was clapping. Lindsay, behind the glow of a private burner account, left an anonymous comment on the article's reposted version. Another bitter old woman trying to be a martyr. Sad, really. What she didn't realize was that Martin had preemptively flagged her activity through metadata. The moment the comment hit, the server logged the IP, matched to a local provider, tied to a user account Brian had once foolishly bundled with Lindsay's credit card. It was deleted, flagged, reported. The next morning, Brian received a letter in a heavy white envelope, with the family crest pressed into the wax seal. He opened it over the kitchen sink. Subject: Executor Status Termination *. Mr. Flynn, you are no longer named executor or emergency proxy on any trust or will related to Margaret Flynn. All associated privileges have been legally revoked and reassigned. There is nothing more to discuss. Martin Sloane, Esquire. Asterisk back on Hickory Lane. Maggie stood at the entrance of her home, now legally Tessa's future sanctuary, and watched as the contractor affixed the final touch. A bronze plaque, centered beneath the doorbell, the engraving read, "Silence not served here." They fed her shame, one bite at a time, polite corrections, clipped tones, eyes that rolled before words even left her mouth. So Maggie Flynn served them what they never expected: quiet, decisive consequence. On a clear Wednesday morning, she slid 2 ivory envelopes into her mailbox. No stamps. These were local deliveries, hand-addressed in her signature cursive. One to Brian, one to Lindsay. She watched the postman lift them with a nod, unaware of the shift he was about to deliver. Inside each envelope, 3 pages of ink and intention. Brian, what I had to give, you didn't value. What I needed from you, you refused to offer. This is not punishment. This is clarity. Lindsay, you treated my presence like clutter. You mocked my breath, my voice, my very body. You will not inherit the weight of me. No money, no house, no heirlooms. Just a full final sentence where they'd once assumed ellipses. Ruth arrived that afternoon, binder in hand and fire in her stride. "Ready?" she asked. "Always," Maggie replied. They sat together at the kitchen island, just the two of them, as it had so often been, and flipped through the details of Maggie's funeral plans. Casket pre-selected, music arranged, Tessa's recording of Claire de Lune, not some canned hymn, no viewing, no forced apologies at the pulpit. Maggie had even prepared her obituary, short, direct, and intentionally missing names. "You're sure?" Ruth asked gently, pointing to the empty survived field. "Dead sure," Maggie said without flinching. They clinked coffee mugs like champagne flutes. 2 hours later, the confrontation arrived. Lindsay's knock rattled the front door, fast, frantic, the kind of knock meant to intimidate, not ask. Maggie didn't jump. She stood from her chair, walked to the door, and opened it just wide enough for eye contact. "You think this letter ends something?" Lindsay snapped, waving the now creased paper. "You don't get to cut me out of your legacy like it's a grocery list." Maggie looked at her. Really looked. Lindsay's eyeliner was too sharp, her blouse too crisp, her voice just a little too loud. An unraveling person disguised as composed. "I didn't cut you out," Maggie said. "You walked out years ago. I'm just catching up." Then she closed the door. Quietly. Not a slam. Just a decision sealed. From the top of the stairs, Tessa had watched the whole thing. Later that night, she curled up beside Maggie on the couch, her legs tucked under her like a cat. "You sound stronger lately," she said, her voice barely louder than the hum of the night lamp. Maggie didn't answer at first. She simply reached over, brushed a strand of hair from Tessa's cheek, and whispered, "Because I'm done being silenced." They sat like that, 2 generations stitched together by honesty, not bloodlines. Tessa rested her head on Maggie's shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. Later that evening, long after the neighborhood had gone dark, Tessa crept into her room and opened her jewelry box. The locket Maggie had given her weeks ago still lay nestled in the velvet. She opened it. The tiny brass key inside caught the moonlight. Heart beating faster, she tiptoed to the hallway closet, where Maggie had told her, offhandedly, almost in passing, that not all safes need walls. Behind the cedar chest was a fireproof lockbox. Tessa inserted the key. It turned with a soft click. Inside, sealed in a crisp blue envelope, was a letter, the handwriting unmistakable. She unfolded it. "Tessa, this is your beginning. Not because you asked, but because you listened. Let the world hear you. Make room for no one's silence but your own." At the bottom in bold ink, "You are the only one who ever saw the whole song." She said, "My cough ruined dinner." So Maggie set a new table, one that never included her again. The sunlight cut soft through the lace curtains that morning, pouring warmth over polished countertops and fresh-cut peonies. Maggie stood at the stove in a denim apron, flipping herb frittatas with ease. The kitchen smelled of browned butter, lemon zest, and brewing coffee. No roast lamb, no passive-aggressive silences, just real food, real presence. The legacy brunch, as Ruth had jokingly dubbed it, wasn't about celebration, it was about reclamation. Maggie hadn't thrown a party. She'd created a gathering of the people who still listened when she spoke, and didn't flinch when she cleared her throat. The table wasn't long or grand. It was an oval oak four-seater with 2 extra chairs added and mismatched linens that had once belonged to Maggie's mother. At one end sat Martin Sloane in a navy sweater, smiling behind his reading glasses. Ruth, in her signature silver bangles, was already halfway into her second mimosa. Claire and Ben, Maggie's former students, brought fresh-baked pastries and hugs that meant more than inheritance ever could. And then there was Tessa. She stood behind her seat, hands trembling slightly as she held a folded paper. Maggie gave her a nod, steady and proud. Tessa unfolded her page. "This house," she began, her voice clear despite the quiver, "breathes because she stayed loud. It's warm because she didn't shrink when they tried to dim her. I used to think legacy was something you get. I know now it's something you carry." No one clapped. Not yet. They just listened. And that, to Maggie, was the loudest applause she'd ever earned. She coughed once without shame. Not loud. Just natural. And no one said a word. No furrowed brows. No pursed lips. Not even a glance. Ruth passed her a glass of water without fanfare. Maggie took it, smiling behind the rim. That single moment undid years. After the speeches and the second round of coffee, she rose and placed one final chair at the end of the table, carefully angled, intentionally unoccupied. A single folded place card rested on the plate. Courtesy absent. Ruth raised her brow, then her glass, to coughing up boundaries. Everyone laughed. Not mockery, but recognition. It was joy with a spine. Martin leaned toward Maggie as the laughter softened. "This feels like closure." "No," she said, folding her napkin with care. "This feels like clarity." As the brunch wrapped up, Maggie stood at the doorway and hugged each guest. The air outside had shifted. The early autumn breeze whispering through the tree with the gentleness of something earned. Tessa lingered last. "Grandma," she said, "can we do this again?" "Only if you plan it," Maggie replied. Tessa grinned. "Deal." Inside, Ruth had begun cleaning plates. Maggie stood at the entrance, watching the table she had finally made her own. The sunlight caught the bronze plaque outside, "Silence not served here," and for a moment she thought she heard the house exhale. Then her phone buzzed. A notification lit the screen. City of Lincoln, Office of Civic Engagement nomination for Annual Elder Advocacy Award. Margaret Flynn. She stared at the message, lips parting in stunned quiet. It was unsolicited, unexpected, and despite her best efforts, not unwelcome. The house wasn't just breathing, it was finally speaking back. She tried to shame a cough, tried to shrink it down to rudeness, to illness, to something Maggie should have apologized for. But Maggie answered with silence and ink. The house was still that morning, full of low light and lavender air. Maggie moved slowly through the halls of what had once been everyone else's expectation, and was now entirely her own. Her slippers made soft sounds against the hardwood, the kind of quiet that felt earned, not imposed. In the parlor, the upright piano sang faintly. Tessa's recording of Claire de Lune playing on loop from the little Bluetooth speaker nestled between old music books. Maggie didn't touch the volume. The notes drifted just right. Not loud. Not performative. Just there. Present. She passed the hallway photo wall, now curated only with images that mattered. A black and white shot of Ruth and Maggie from 1962. A framed drawing of a girl and her grandmother at a piano bench, Tessa's of course. No filtered family portraits. No forced smiles in beige-toned frames. She reached her study and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside, everything was where it should be. The will, signed and certified. The medical directive. The trust certifications. Even the deed transfer, now bearing Tessa's name beneath the official seal of the state. Maggie pulled out the will, smoothed it on the desk, and laid her hand flat over the last page. Then she reached for a folded sheet of thick stationery, the final letter she hadn't shared yet. Her last note, no addressee, just a sentence, sharp, clean, and permanent. If you don't value my breath, you don't deserve my name. She slid it beneath the music box Brian had once loved as a boy, cherry wood etched with wild flowers. A relic of gentler days that hadn't lasted. Still, she didn't discard it. She simply placed it over the letter like punctuation. Then she walked back through the house. The kitchen was sunlit, her herbs dancing on the sill in a gentle breeze. The brass kettle hummed on the stove. Toast popped from the antique toaster with a satisfying spring. She sat at the table, alone, but not lonely, her fingers wrapped around her mug, the heat threading into her palms. She looked around, not to check for something missing, but to take in what remained, what she had reclaimed. This was no longer the house where she'd once been dismissed. It was the house she had reauthored. Outside, the front plaque caught the morning light. Silence not served here, gleamed in gold against its bronze plate, the lettering proud and precise. A neighbor walking her golden retriever paused to read it. She smiled, tipped her chin toward the house in a silent salute, and moved on. The door creaked gently behind Maggie. Tessa peeked in, her braid loose from the wind. Her cheeks were flushed with cold. Her sneakers squeaked faintly on the hardwood. "Ready for another song?" she asked. Maggie turned, a slow smile blooming across her face. "Always." And in that smile, in that room full of reclaimed sound and deliberate silence, every moment of erasure was undone. Every word not spoken, every breath stifled, every glance dismissed. They had all led here. She took one more sip of tea, placed the cup on the table, and stood. She said, "Don't cough." So I did, and then I cleared the air permanently.